The words tore from her throat like broken glass. She dropped to her knees on the warped floorboards, clutching the foreclosure notice against her chest. Outside, thunder rolled across the Montana sky like cannon fire. Dutch Morgan stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat brim, his rifle pointed at nothing now. The woman's cry had stopped him cold. Something in her voice cut through years of hardened instinct. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much loss for someone so young. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins. The yellow dress she wore was faded but clean, patched at the elbows with careful stitches. He lowered the rifle completely. The wind howled through the open door, scattering papers across the floor. Dutch stepped inside and pushed the door closed behind him. The sudden quiet felt heavy. Lara Croft remained on her knees, watching him with the wariness of a cornered animal. She had mistaken him for another claim jumper. Another vulture come to pick at what remained of her life. Dutch pulled the folded deed from his coat pocket. The paper was still damp from the storm. He held it out to her without speaking. She took it with trembling fingers. Her eyes moved across the legal words, the official stamps, the bank's signature. The color drained from her face. "You bought it," her voice was barely a whisper, "3 days ago." She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with hands that shook. The foreclosure notice fluttered to the floor between them. 6 months of fighting, of scraping together payments, of selling everything she owned piece by piece, all for nothing. "I thought you were here to steal what was left." Dutch studied her face. The desperation was still there, but something else had crept in, a kind of fierce dignity that reminded him of wild horses he'd seen, magnificent even in defeat. "I'm not a thief." Thunder crashed again, closer this time. The windows rattled in their frames. Lara moved to the fireplace where a few coals still glowed. She added kindling with practiced movements, not looking at him. "What are you then?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Dutch set his rifle against the wall and removed his hat. His dark hair was streaked with early gray. Lines around his eyes spoke of too many years under an unforgiving sun. A man looking for something different. She turned to face him. The firelight caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Different from what? He didn't answer, couldn't answer. The truth was a loaded gun he'd never learned to handle safely. The fire began to catch, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The small room felt smaller with both of them in it. Lara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how alone they were. "I have nowhere to go." The words came out flat, matter of fact. "No family, no money. Nathan's people back east wouldn't take me in even if I could afford the train fare." Dutch walked to the window and looked out at the storm-lashed landscape. Lightning illuminated the barn he now owned, the corrals, the fence lines that needed mending. Beyond that, nothing but endless grassland and sky. "How much do you know about running cattle?" The question caught her off guard. "Everything. I've been doing it for 3 years." "By yourself?" "Nathan was sick a long time before he died. The ranch was mine to run." Dutch turned from the window. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The desperation was still there, but it was mixing with something else now, possibility. "I know how to buy land, I know how to shoot. I don't know the first thing about making a place like this work." Lara's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we can help each other." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled behind her, painting her silhouette in warm light. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "You want me to work for you? With me, as a partner?" "Partners in what?" "Making this place what it was meant to be." The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself was waiting for her answer. Lara looked around the room that had been her home, her prison, her last stand against a world that had taken everything from her. "I'd need my own space, my own say in how things are run." "Agreed. And if this partnership works, if we make something real here." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "What you heard me say when you came in, about family, I meant it." Dutch felt something stir in his chest, a longing he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, the chance to build instead of destroy, to create instead of take. "I'd like that." She walked to him then, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped just close enough to see the flecks of green in his gray eyes, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow. "I don't even know your name." "Dutch Morgan. I'm Lara Croft." She extended her hand. He took it, noting the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. The handshake lasted longer than necessary. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass. The thunder grew more distant, the rain against the windows gentled to a steady patter. "So we're partners then?" Lara's voice held something it hadn't before, hope. Partners? They stood there in the firelight, two people who had lost everything finding something unexpected in each other. The ranch stretched around them in the darkness, waiting to be reborn. 3 months had passed since the storm. The ranch bore little resemblance to the broken place Dutch had purchased. Fresh timber replaced rotted fence posts. The barn stood straight and strong, its new red paint bright against the endless sky. Lara moved through the morning chores with practiced efficiency. She scattered feed for the chickens, checked the water troughs, counted the cattle grazing in the north pasture. The work had shaped her differently now. Her shoulders were broader, her hands sure and steady. Dutch emerged from the barn carrying a saddle that needed mending. He'd learned to repair leather over the long winter months, his fingers growing skilled with needle and thread. The work was honest. Clean, it felt foreign in his hands. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people know each other's rhythms. Lara pointed to a section of fence that sagged. Dutch nodded and gathered his tools. The partnership had taken root deeper than either had expected. They made decisions together, shared the burden of planning and labor. But they kept their separate spaces, their careful boundaries. Dutch slept in the barn loft, Lara in the main house. Neither spoke of the night when fevered words had tumbled from her lips. Neither mentioned the promise of children or the way his eyes had changed when she'd offered everything she had. The town of Redemption Valley lay 5 miles south, a cluster of weathered buildings against the prairie. Dutch rode there twice a week for supplies, enduring the stares and whispered conversations that followed in his wake. The shopkeeper's wife clutched her purse tighter when he entered. The men at the saloon fell silent until he passed. They knew he was different, dangerous in ways they couldn't name, but he paid in cash and caused no trouble. What they whispered about most was the arrangement. A man and woman unmarried working the same land. It wasn't decent, they said, it wasn't proper. Lara felt their judgment when she accompanied Dutch to town. The church ladies turned their backs. The preacher's wife made pointed comments about moral standards and Christian values. She held her head high and ignored them all. On this particular morning, the sky stretched cloudless and blue. The spring grass had come in thick and green. The cattle were fat and healthy. Everything spoke of prosperity, of dreams taking shape. Dutch worked on the fence while Lara tended the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the house. Tomatoes and beans climbed wooden stakes. Carrots and potatoes grew in neat rows. The soil was rich and dark, full of promise. She knelt between the rows, pulling weeds with methodical precision. The sun warmed her back through the thin fabric of her dress. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Dutch's hammer rang against the fence posts in steady rhythm. The sound echoed across the valley, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. He paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, his eyes finding her bent form in the garden. Something tightened in his chest. The sight of her there, creating life from empty earth, stirred feelings he'd thought long dead. He forced himself to look away. At midday they ate together on the porch, sharing bread and cheese and water drawn cold from the well. The conversation was sparse but comfortable. Plans for the afternoon, weather observations. The small practical matters that filled their days. But underneath the ordinary words, something else pulsed. The awareness of hands almost touching when they passed the water jar. The way her laugh changed when she caught him watching her. The careful space they maintained between their chairs. As afternoon faded to evening, they worked side by side in the barn. Dutch repaired harness leather while Lara organized the tools, hanging each in its proper place. The work was mindless soothing, but the enclosed space made them hyper-aware of each other. Their shoulders brushed when they reached for the same lantern. The contact sent electricity through both of them, but neither acknowledged it. They moved apart again, maintaining the invisible line they'd drawn. The sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the western sky the color of fire. They stood on the porch watching it sink below the horizon, neither speaking. The silence held weight and meaning. Inside, Lara prepared their simple supper. Dutch sat at the table, his hands folded, watching her move about the kitchen. She'd learned to cook over the winter, transforming basic ingredients into nourishing meals. The domesticity of it felt strange and wonderful. After supper, they sat by the fire planning the next day's work. The spring roundup was coming. They would need to brand the new calves, separate the cattle bound for market. It was hard work that required perfect coordination. "We'll need help," Lara said, mending a shirt by firelight. "I know some men who might work for fair wages." "Will they work for you?" Dutch was quiet for a long moment. His past cast shadows he couldn't escape even here. "We'll see." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing light on the walls. Outside, night sounds drifted through the open windows. An owl called from the cottonwoods by the creek. Cattle shifted and settled in the distant pasture. Lara set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "Dutch, yes. Are you happy here?" The question hung in the air between them. He studied her face in the firelight, noting the small changes 3 months had wrought. The worry lines around her eyes had softened. Her mouth was less tight with constant vigilance. "I'm something I've never been before." "What's that?" "Useful." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, erasing years of sorrow and fear. "You're more than useful." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Dutch felt himself leaning toward her, drawn by something stronger than gravity. Her lips parted slightly, her breathing quickened. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the spell. They sprang apart, the connection broken. Dutch moved to the window, his hand instinctively finding the gun at his hip. Three riders approached through the darkness, their horses' hooves drumming against the packed earth. Dutch recognized the lead rider's silhouette before he spoke. "That's Sheriff Freeman." Lara joined him at the window, her shoulder brushing his arm. "What does he want?" "Nothing good." The riders pulled up in the yard. Sheriff Freeman dismounted and approached the porch, his spurs ringing with each step. His face was grim in the lantern light. "Dutch Morgan, Sheriff, we need to talk." Dutch stepped onto the porch, leaving Lara in the doorway. The night air was cool against his skin. Around them, the ranch they'd built together waited in the darkness, suddenly feeling fragile as spun glass. "What about?" Freeman's hand rested on his gun belt. His two deputies flanked him, their faces hard and watchful. "Albert Wesker's been caught down in New Mexico territory." The name hit Dutch like a physical blow. He went very still, his breathing shallow. Behind him, Lara stepped closer, sensing danger. "What's that got to do with me?" "You know exactly what it's got to do with you." Sheriff Freeman's words fell between them like stones in still water. "Wesker's talking. Says you were part of his gang for 2 years. Says you helped rob the Denver Pacific Line and the Cheyenne Bank." Dutch's face went white in the lantern light. Behind him, Lara's sharp intake of breath cut through the night air. The deputies shifted their weight, hands hovering near their weapons. "That was a long time ago. Murder don't get old, Dutch, neither does robbery." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Lara stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. She stood beside Dutch, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body. "You've got 3 weeks to get to Santa Fe. Judge wants your testimony against Wesker before he sentences him to hang." Dutch's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "And if I don't come, then I'll be back with a warrant and a rope." The sheriff remounted his horse. The leather creaked in the stillness. His deputies followed suit, their spurs jangling. They rode back into the darkness, leaving Dutch and Lara alone with the weight of truth. Inside the house, silence stretched between them. Lara moved to the mantel where Dutch kept his personal belongings. Her fingers found the small wooden box he'd brought from his saddlebags months ago. "Don't." But she was already lifting the lid. Inside lay a folded wanted poster, yellowed with age. Her own face stared back at her from the crude drawing. "Dutch Morgan, wanted for armed robbery and murder. $500 reward." Her hands shook as she read the charges. The dates, the crimes that painted him as everything she'd hoped he wasn't. "You lied to me." "I never lied. You let me believe you were something you're not." Dutch reached for the poster, but she pulled it away. The paper crackled between her fingers. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was trying to become the man you deserved. By hiding who you really were. By leaving who I was behind." She walked to the window and stared out at the land they'd built together. The barn stood solid and strong. The fence lines ran straight and true. The cattle dotted the pasture like dark stones against green grass. "All of this, was it real?" "It was the realest thing I've ever done." She turned to face him. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks. "How do I know what's true anymore?" Dutch moved toward her but stopped when she stepped back. The distance between them felt infinite. Everything they'd built was crumbling, turning to dust in their hands. "The work was real. The partnership was real. What I feel for you is real." "What you feel for me?" The question hung between them. Dutch had never spoken the words aloud, had never allowed himself to name the thing that had grown between them over the long winter months. "I love you." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Lara closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging under the weight of it all. When she opened them again, her face was resolute. "Then why didn't you trust me?" He had no answer. The truth was too complicated, too tangled with shame and fear and the bone-deep certainty that he wasn't worthy of what she offered. The next morning, word spread through Redemption Valley. Dutch Morgan wasn't just a drifter who'd bought the Croft Ranch. He was an outlaw, a killer, a man with blood on his hands. The general store refused to serve them. The blacksmith turned them away. Children ran when they saw Dutch coming. Women crossed the street to avoid Lara's path. "You should have told me," Lara said as they rode back to the ranch. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the reins too tightly. "Would you have let me stay?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say. At the ranch, Dutch began to pack. His belongings fit in a single saddlebag, 3 months of the best life he'd ever known, reduced to a handful of possessions and memories he'd carry until he died. Lara worked in the garden, pulling weeds with violent efficiency. Her movements were sharp and angry. The plants seemed to wilt under her touch. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning." "And then?" "I testify." "Hope the judge believes I've changed." "Have you?" Dutch paused in his packing. The question cut deeper than any blade. "I thought I had." That evening they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table. The meal between them grew cold, neither with appetite for food. The silence was different now, heavier, full of endings. "I'll lose the ranch," Lara said finally. "No, it's in your name now." "I signed it over this afternoon." She looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because it was always yours, I just helped you save it." The gesture should have softened her anger, instead it seemed to make everything worse. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't want your guilt money. It's not guilt, it's love. Don't, her voice cracked. Don't make this about love. She fled to her room, leaving Dutch alone with the echo of her footsteps. He sat in the darkness, watching the fire die to embers. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows he'd repaired with his own hands. Before dawn, he saddled his horse in the barn they'd rebuilt together. The familiar weight of his gun belt felt strange around his waist. The clothes he'd worn when he first arrived still smelled of leather and dust, and the violent life he'd tried to leave behind. He left the letter on the kitchen table, weighed down with a stone from the creek where they'd watered the cattle. In it, he'd tried to explain everything. The gang, the crimes, the way she'd changed him from the inside out. The way he'd rather hang than drag her down with him. The horse's hooves rang against the packed earth as he rode toward the rising sun. Behind him, the ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. He didn't look back. Inside the house, Lara found the letter as the first light touched the eastern sky. Her tears fell on the paper, smearing the ink. By the time she finished reading, he was already gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind had stilled. The ranch stretched around her, empty and waiting. Everything they'd built together suddenly felt hollow. She crumpled the letter in her fist and threw it into the cold fireplace. But the words remained, burned into her memory. The truth about who he was, the truth about who he'd tried to become, the truth about what she'd lost. The Santa Fe courthouse baked under the merciless sun. Dutch sat in the witness chair, his hands folded in his lap, watching the prosecutor pace before the jury. The man's voice droned on about crime and punishment, about justice delayed but not denied. Albert Wesker sat at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed on Dutch with venomous hatred. The years in prison had carved deep lines in his face. His hair had gone white, but the evil in him burned as bright as ever. Mr. Morgan, the prosecutor said, turning to face him. You rode with the defendant for 2 years. You participated in his crimes. Why should this court believe anything you say? Dutch's throat felt dry as dust. The courtroom was packed with spectators, their faces hard and judgmental. He'd spent 3 weeks in the county jail preparing for this moment. 3 weeks of remembering every detail of the life he'd tried to forget. Because I'm not proud of what I did, I'm not trying to save myself, I'm trying to tell the truth. The prosecutor nodded and continued his questioning. Dutch answered each query with quiet precision, describing the robberies, the violence, the way Wesker had ruled through fear and brutality. But as he spoke, Dutch noticed something. The prosecutor's questions were leading somewhere unexpected, details about specific crimes, dates and times that didn't match Dutch's memory, information that painted a different picture entirely. Mr. Morgan, you say you participated in the Denver Pacific robbery, but wasn't it true that you were the one who ensured no passengers were harmed? Dutch frowned. I don't understand. Wasn't it true that you deliberately warned the conductor about Wesker's plan to burn the passenger cars? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Wesker's face darkened with rage. Dutch stared at the prosecutor, confusion written across his features. I never told anyone about that. No, but others did. The prosecutor approached the bench and handed the judge a thick folder. Your Honor, I have here testimony from 17 witnesses. Passengers, railroad employees, bank clerks, all describing how the defendant Dutch Morgan repeatedly acted to protect innocent lives during these alleged crimes. The judge opened the folder, his weathered face impassive. Dutch felt the world tilting beneath him. Nothing made sense anymore. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, I have here a letter from the territorial governor's office. It seems Mr. Morgan was operating under the direct orders of federal marshals. He was gathering intelligence on Wesker's gang from the inside. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Spectators shouted questions. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. Wesker lunged toward Dutch, screaming accusations of betrayal before the bailiffs restrained him. Dutch sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. The letters he'd written and never sent. The reports he'd filed thinking they were useless. The desperate attempts to minimize violence that he'd thought were just personal weakness. It had all been real, official, legal. The trial recessed for deliberation. Dutch found himself in the judge's chambers, facing a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the territorial governor's representative. You never knew, did you? The man said, settling into a chair. Knew what? That you were working for us. That every report you filed, every warning you gave was part of an official investigation. Dutch's hands trembled as he accepted the official documents. Pardons, commendations. An offer of employment as a territorial marshal. But I never meant to be a spy, I just wanted to stop the killing. That's exactly why you were perfect for the job. The trial resumed the next day. Wesker was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. Dutch walked out of the courthouse a free man, his past crimes erased by federal pardon. But freedom felt hollow without someone to share it with. The territorial governor offered him a position in Santa Fe. Good pay, respectability, a chance to help tame the wild territories. Dutch accepted, but his heart remained hundreds of miles north, in a small ranch house where a woman with sad eyes had offered him everything. 6 months passed. Dutch proved himself as a territorial marshal, tracking down outlaws and bringing order to lawless towns. But every sunset reminded him of evenings on the porch with Lara. Every meal tasted like ash without her across the table. The governor called him into his office on a cold February morning. Snow dusted the mountains outside the window. The fire in the grate did nothing to warm the chill in Dutch's chest. "I have a proposition for you, Morgan. Sir, we need someone to establish a marshal's office in the Northern Territories, someone who knows the land and the people. Someone who can bring law to places that have never seen it." Dutch's pulse quickened. "Where?" "Montana Territory, based out of a town called Redemption Valley." The ride north took 3 days. Dutch pushed his horse hard, covering ground with the urgency of a man returning from the dead. The familiar landscape unfolded before him, vast and beautiful and full of memories. He crested the ridge above the valley as the sun touched the western horizon. Below him, the town spread out in the gathering dusk, and beyond it, nestled against the creek, the ranch he'd helped build. Smoke rose from the chimney. Cattle grazed in the pasture. The place looked prosperous, well-maintained. His heart swelled with pride at what she'd accomplished alone. He rode down into the valley as stars appeared in the darkening sky. The town was quiet, windows glowing with lamplight. A few people paused to watch him pass, but he didn't stop. At the ranch, he dismounted and walked slowly toward the house. Light spilled from the windows. He could see her moving inside, setting the table for supper. The sight of her nearly brought him to his knees. She must have heard his footsteps because she appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light. She wore a blue dress he'd never seen before. Her hair was longer, gathered at the nape of her neck. "Dutch," he stepped into the circle of light cast by the porch lamp. The marshal's badge gleamed on his chest. Her eyes found it immediately, then moved to his face. "I came back to take you up on that offer." "Which offer?" "All of them, the partnership, the family, the life." She moved toward him slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. Her hand reached out to touch the badge, her fingers tracing the metal surface. "You're a marshal now, part-time, based here in Redemption Valley. And the other part of the time, I'd like to be a rancher. If you'll have me." The tears came then, spilling down her cheeks in the lamplight. He reached up to wipe them away, his thumb gentle against her skin. "I never stopped loving you. I know. I read your letter 100 times. Can you forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive. You became exactly who I always believed you were." She took his hand and placed it on her growing belly. The swell was small but unmistakable. His eyes widened in wonder. "When?" 4 months from now." He pulled her into his arms then, burying his face in her hair. She smelled of soap and sunshine and the promise of home. Around them, the ranch settled into evening quiet. "Marry me?" he whispered against her ear. "Yes." The wedding took place in the same church where the congregation had once shunned them. Now they filled the pews, celebrating the union of the marshal and the woman who tamed him. The preacher spoke of redemption and second chances. Dutch stood at the altar in his best suit, the marshal's badge pinned to his lapel. Lara walked down the aisle in her mother's white dress, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause. Outside, the sun shone bright and clear. The future stretched before them, full of possibility. Months later, Dutch held his newborn son in the same room where Lara had once begged for her life. The baby's eyes were dark, his grip strong. He would grow up on this land, surrounded by love and the stories of how his parents found each other. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Dutch balanced his duties as marshal with the work of ranching. Lara managed the household and the business with quiet efficiency. Together, they built something lasting and true. On warm evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The baby slept in Lara's arms while Dutch planned the next day's work. The peace between them was complete. The land had given them everything they'd ever wanted. A home, a family, a chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of their broken pasts. In the distance, cattle grazed in green pastures. The barn stood solid and strong. The fence lines ran straight and true toward the horizon where their future waited, bright and full of promise. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.